Hello, and welcome to Skynet Today's Let's Talk AI podcast, where you can hear from AI researchers about what's actually going on with AI and what is just clickbait headlines. This is our latest Last Week in AI episode, in which you can get a quick digest of last week's AI news, as well as a bit of discussion between two AI researchers as to what we think about this news. To start things off, we'll hand it off to Daniel Bashir to summarize what happened in AI last week. We'll be back in just a few minutes to dive deeper into these stories and give our takes.
Hello, this is Daniel Bashir here with our weekly news summary. This week, we'll look at two facial recognition stories and two governance stories. First off, January 6th has already become a date that will likely live in infamy. The Verge reports that after the Capitol insurrection, the use of infamous facial recognition app Clearview AI spiked, jumping by 26%. The attack was broadcast live and captured in hundreds of images that showed the faces of rioters, and in the aftermath, the FBI and other agencies have asked for public help in identifying participants. The Miami and Alabama police departments in particular have been reported to be using Clearview to identify rioters. While it's certainly a good use to make sure that those who participated in the events face consequences, the use of technologies like Clearview still raises concerns. Next, a facial recognition study at Stanford claims there are links between facial features and political orientation. As VentureBee reports, Stanford-affiliated researcher Mikhail Kosinski used a dataset of over 1 million images to train an algorithm to correctly classify political orientation in 72% of face pairs. The work as a whole embraces the pseudoscientific concept of physiognomy, which claims that facets of a person's character can be divined from their appearance. While Kosinski distances the research from such concepts, they don't dismiss them altogether. Kosinski also made the project's source code and dataset available, but not the actual images. This is somewhat transparent, but makes an audit for bias and experimental flaws impossible. Research that could potentially impact people's lives, especially in the area of facial recognition, raises many ethical questions. Systems like Kosinski's should be tested and audited extensively before they are even considered for practical use. On Tuesday, the White House established an office for coordinating AI research and policymaking across government, industry, and academia. As FedScoop reports, the new National AI Initiative Office will serve as a central hub for national AI research and policy. The National AI Initiative Act that established the office was passed as part of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2021 earlier this month. The law also codified the American AI Initiative to increase research investment, increase compute access, set technical standards, build a workforce, and engage with allies. The White House-based Select Committee on AI was expanded and made permanent to oversee the initiative, while the National AI Research Institutes and a National Strategic Plan were also codified. And finally, while the US developed its national AI strategy, the FDA issued an action plan for regulating AI in medical devices. As MedTech Dive reports, the action plan comes amid calls for regulatory clarity on machine learning algorithms. The FDA has only approved and cleared devices that use machine learning algorithms that are locked, and that they do not change without manual updates. As medtech companies such as Medtronic begin incorporating AI capabilities into their products, the industry has been waiting for an update on the FDA's oversight plan. The FDA's action plan document touted the ability to learn from real-world experience to improve device performance as an advantage of AI software. The goal is to provide assurances of safety and effectiveness while allowing for iterative improvement of machine learning-based software on medical devices. That's all for this week's news roundup. Stay tuned for a more in-depth discussion of recent events.
Thanks, Daniel, and welcome back, listeners. Now that you've had that summary of last week's news, feel free to stick around for a more laid-back discussion about this news by two AI researchers. One of them is me, Andrei Kurenkov, a third-year PhD student at the Stanford Vision and Learning Lab. I focus mostly on learning algorithms for robotic manipulation in my research. And with me is my co-host.
I'm Sharon, a fourth-year PhD student in the machine learning group working with Andrew Ng. I do research on generative models, improving generalization neural networks, and applying machine learning to tackling the climate crisis as well as to medicine.
And it's pretty interesting. We are recording on the 20th, a very news-filled day in the US. But as usual, we're going to stick to discussion of AI news. I think we have enough politics surrounding us everywhere. And unfortunately, we're going to have to get a little political vote with this first story related to what's going on in the US. This title here from The Verge is Use of Clearview AI Facial Recognition Tech Spiked as Law Enforcement Seek to Identify Capitol Mob. So, as the title implies, Clearview AI, which provides the ability to basically Google search people by their face, to identify people by photos of their face to get their name, they actually released information that after the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol building by rioters, use of that technology spiked by a lot as different law enforcement agencies like Miami Police Department and here the Alabama and even other departments were sending reports to the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. Possibly an okay application in this case, kind of perhaps you can make a justification for it, but at the same time, always the scary thing is if this gets normalized, maybe this gets applied in other contexts where it's less nice. Overall, just a reminder of the dystopian trends we seem to be having with surveillance and it not being regulated at all. What does it kind of make you feel or think, Sharon?
Well, it feels like every time there's some type of event that law enforcement needs to be, I guess, deployed in large quantities, but also people need to be, I guess, held responsible for their actions, a spike in Clearview happens, right? And so I definitely think there needs to be some kind of regulation. There needs to be certain standards for this technology because it's starting to get very mainstream and used very, very often. So I think, I just feel like there needs to be more attention put on them in terms of regulation. I can see how I've heard arguments where people say, hey, like, why can't we just, it should just be about prevention, like we should just prevent the need for this. But of course, realistically, humans were just notoriously bad at prevention. That's why diabetes and is such a big problem in this country because they didn't prevent, there wasn't enough prevention for healthy eating and exercise, etc. And so I don't know, like it's hard. It's really hard to just say, let's prevent. So I think it does make sense to have some regulation to make sure that whatever it is we're using afterwards is safe and fair.
Exactly. And something to note here is that there is some regulation. What we're meaning here is that there's no federal regulation that applies across different states, where obviously this is a case where different departments can use it at their discretion, even if some local departments do have regulations for it in place. And as you said, there is a bit in this article quoting Nathan Fried-Wessler, Deputy Director of the SCLU's Speech Privacy and Technology Project, that makes the point that the potential for mass surveillance of communities of color have rightly led to some local and state governments to ban it. Because, yes, right now it's being used in this context where most in the US may agree rioting on the state capitol is bad, but then when it's used next time, it might be against a different context where it might be a peaceful protest or something like that, which you know about, Sharon, as someone who developed a tool to actually protect people protesting for Black Lives Matters to prevent identification. So yeah, it's another reminder that we need regulation, and certainly we need a more consistent basis for how to use technology like that of Clearview AI.
Yes, and speaking about regulation, our next article is titled FDA Issues Action Plan for Regulating AI in Medical Devices. So now, as we step away from facial recognition and look into a highly regulated industry, medicine, the FDA is now looking into how to regulate specifically AI and machine learning in software as a medical device area. So this is exciting that there are, this trend is happening, and that there is work being done on regulating AI, specifically here in medical devices. I'm sure folks in the government regulating, facial recognition could take some ideas from this as well from the FDA. What are your thoughts on the new FDA action plan, Andre?
Yeah, it's cool to see that this is happening, certainly. And the article here has some details that are interesting where, for instance, so far the FDA has only approved or cleared devices that have locked algorithms that don't change over time. But of course, machine learning is a very fast evolving field, and its application to medicine is evolving super rapidly. So you must imagine that companies developing these algorithms have a hard time with the sort of regulation where you have to lock in an algorithm when you can actually make it continuously better with machine learning. So, so far, it's not seen much progress. The FDA published a discussion paper nearly 2 years ago, but industry has been waiting for how regulation will happen. So in this case, it sounds like the FDA has the right idea of touting the ability to learn from real-world experience to improve device performance, and allowing it presumably. So need to see that there is an action plan. It'll be interesting to see how quickly this action plan actually turns into regulation. Year or two, I don't know, but I guess we'll see if this podcast is around when it happens. It'll be interesting to talk about.
Yeah, so to shed a bit more light on the locked algorithms idea, the FDA very much makes it so that you have to basically freeze all your weights for your model and test it at a certain checkpoint, for example, and then never change it, or don't change it for years. And obviously that could be pretty detrimental if your distribution shifts, or you want to use your model on a different, or even want to use any type of fine tuning or few shot approach. I feel like it basically restricts all of those. And obviously this has pros and cons, right? The pro is that people can't make different changes, small changes that might actually very much hurt model performance or hurt patient outcomes in some way. But also this has its own issues, as I've talked to people who wear a certain medical device and they're like, yeah, it's FDA approved, but it sucks because they couldn't change the interface. So it's in this really bad interface. And even though they know it's bad, now that they've gotten feedback from users, it's too late. They got approved in that frozen state, in that locked state. And so I think for all of software, it's actually quite useful to not be completely locked. But for AI in particular, it's almost necessary. It's very much part of the whole cell of this software. And so I think it is important that the FDA is having these conversations. I think obviously they are not completely sure of how to move forward, which is why they're having all these discussions. And they're going to have, I think, another workshop, a public workshop about it too.
Yeah, so certainly another area where regulation is something we'd want. It seems like an area where maybe the current regulation is not up to par. So as you said, good to see that there's a plan. Let's see how quickly we get from that to actual regulation. Now on to a different topic form regulation, something that moves quite a bit faster. Seemingly, it's we're going to discuss an actual research result, which we don't always do in these episodes. Talking about an article from VentureBeat titled "Google Trained a Trillion Parameter AI Language Model." So just last week, we were talking about the new models from OpenAI, where they did both images and text. And once again, with OpenAI, that was a case of increasing scale and feeding more data to a very large model and showing what it can do. This is interesting because with Google's new algorithmic approach, they were able to scale language models to ridiculous 1.6 trillion parameter count, right? So OpenAI, famously with GPT-3, had, I think, 175 gigs of parameters, not trillion. So truly massive language models. But the nice thing is that they claim in here that because they're using something called a switch transformer and a new sparsely activation technique, we won't get into it, but it enables faster training with the same amount of computational resources. So actually, even though this is a case of getting bigger, the technique itself could be used to lower the amount of compute needed to do cutting edge research in this area of language models and processing of text. So that's kind of what I gather here. Anything you noted that's different, Sharon?
I find it, impressive, of course, but also a little bit ironic with Timnit's firing earlier last year. And it's just, this is exactly what she was warning about. So I guess they're not okay with that warning. This seems to be that model very relevant. And so it does go a bit hand in hand with their ethics work.
Yeah, to give a bit more background, we discussed this a little while back. Timnit Gebru, one of the leads of the AI ethics team at Google, was famously fired, reportedly in part over a research paper on the harms of large language models. And here we have the biggest language model so far. So as you said, that not being addressed so much in this research, and Google possibly just pushing forward and using these language models despite their own internal and external work showing that there can be some harm of biases, and basically training on huge amounts of data can lead to baking in the biases where you have, which is not something you want. Hopefully in the future they'll do a better way, do a better job of addressing these things at the same time as scaling up. Certainly they've gotten enough feedback and criticism from, even our podcast and other people in AI related to that.
Right. Absolutely. And so on to how AI, so this is a language model, right? So on to our next article, which is again about AI-powered text. So AI-powered text from this program could fool the government is the next article from Wired. And basically it covers how the government is especially vulnerable to these deepfake text manipulation models. And so, I could definitely see that. One very clear instance of that is that the government can be targeted by essentially these bots that want some kind of thing, and that could be net neutrality. There was an instance of that in 2017 that over 1 million comments submitted to the FCC was actually auto-generated in some way. And so this could definitely be targeted at the government, who is especially vulnerable to this type of these types of attacks, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I guess what we've seen this to some extent before. Here, the interesting bit is the comments were not auto-generated kind of in a simple way, which was often true before, but with just sort of prompts or very simple auto-generation techniques. Here, they were actually generated by AI, and a study found that people could not distinguish the real comments from the fake ones. Whereas maybe if you have a coordinated thing that just uses a script that's very similar, you could see that and kind of discard it. Whereas if you're actually soliciting public feedback and you can't tell apart real comments from troll comments, that's starting to be a little bit more concerning. So I guess another case of, as we just discussed, one of the negative side effects of having very good language models, and a case of AI being used for a harmful end result where we need research to really counteract it and to figure out how we can determine if text is real, how we determine if it comes from actual people. Still very much open-ended, and something we'll be looking and discussing, no doubt, for the coming year or however long it takes for something to come about, because it doesn't seem like we have anything yet that is really tackling this problem.
Right. It's not clear. And I can see how governments are particularly vulnerable due to their lack of, I guess, they do have tech people, but I feel like it's not enough. And the fact that they are a power center to be targeted.
Yeah, it could be maybe this new AI initiative office or whatever we covered last week will lead to some more AI expertise and some more initiatives to protect the government from deepfakes and politics from deepfakes. But we haven't seen that yet, and hopefully we will this year sometime.
And with that, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Skynet Today's Let's Talk AI podcast. You can find the articles we discussed here today and subscribe to our weekly newsletter with similar ones at skynettoday.com.
Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to leave us a rating and a review if you like the show. Be sure to tune in next week.